All right. We're now going to get into some more familiar territory, some things that we're going to deal with some subjects that are about the emergence of us, of humans. We're not quite to where the things that you're going to find very familiar about your life are going to appear, but the anatomical features that all humans share. This is, we refer to this as Anatomically Modern Humans, or AMH, is the abbreviation for that. They emerged at some point. So last chapter we looked at Homo erectus, which was a hugely successful and long-lived species in our genus that emerged from Africa and spread throughout the entirety of the so-called Old World, that is to say Africa, Asia, Europe. But they stopped at major oceans and bodies of water and didn't make it to Australia, they didn't make it to Pacific Islands, they didn't make it to North and South America. But everywhere that was accessible by foot or by very short hop over on a raft or something, even places like Indonesia, was inhabited by Homo erectus. And one of their survival strategies we saw emerging was the use of their brain. They developed new tools, they developed new ways of surviving, hunting animals, working together in cooperative groups. They mastered fire and had the ability to cook things, which expanded their range of foods that they could have, and they also enhanced the properties of the food that they did get. So the brain was being selected as a very advantageous organ for Homo erectus. And that brain, there was some compromises as well, that if you have a bigger brain, you have to give birth to a larger brain baby. And so changes in the way that birthing took place. Also, the babies were born earlier, and this is a gradual process that as the brains got bigger, the infants became born earlier, but that allowed for more socialization because the brain is an important organ for doing things in the real world. Part of that is actually interacting with your fellow Homo erectus, and so socialization allowed for more successful Homo erectus. And we can see that the trend was going, talking about from Australopithecus garhi, which was Australopithecines. They weren't really selecting the brain as a bigger and more important organ. But once garhi started to use tools, we see Homo habilis, and then we see Homo erectus, and we're on the trend towards a larger and larger brain. And that's one of the things that relates to some of the remaining things that we haven't seen develop that are very human-like, which are things like language, speech that we have, which we don't have any evidence for Homo erectus having been able to talk like us. Also, things like domestication, farming, and growing crops. Only humans have done that, and so these are the sort of things that we want to see. When do these very human things emerge? We can see that the trend is moving towards bigger brains in Homo species. But when do Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, emerge? Well, there was not some Homo erectus parents who gave birth to some new species and say, oh, well, we had a human child. That's really strange. It doesn't work that way. These are gradual processes that trend in a particular direction because that's an advantage, because that is an adaptation towards success. So one of the problems with trying to see gradualism in the archaeological or paleontological record is that we get fossils, and these are just moments in time. These are not processes. A fossil is a snapshot of an individual, and we've already seen that the concept of evolution is that once you get your genes, you develop into an adult and then you have offspring, but you getting your genes is kind of where evolution stops in a way with you as an individual. You get what you get through evolution, and then that's it. You pass on what you have to the next generation. So each fossil is just a snapshot of where evolution is in that moment in time with that individual. So the first fossil that we had, the first hominin fossil ever found, we looked at an early one last chapter with the so-called Java man found in Indonesia. But actually there was a little bit earlier, an earlier one that from the 1850s. Actually, Charles Darwin would have known about this Neanderthal fossil found in the Neander Valley in Germany. And a leading German anthropologist, Rudolf Virchow, studied this. And he actually, his first thoughts on this fossil that was discovered in the Neander Valley was that this was a human, but there was a pathology to it. That he thought it had rickets or some other kind of disease, that the differences between what we see in an anatomically modern human and this Neander Valley fossil was something that there was a pathological interpretation that he was making. This was wrong. This was actually a Neanderthal, and it slowly but surely came to light that this actually was something that was an evolutionary development from Homo past. And we're going to look at that, and this was the first snapshot. Now we have a lot more evidence, and we're coming closer into time, which means that that evidence isn't just one bit from this million-year time slot and another bit from another million-year time slot. This is overlapping sets of data that gives us a much clearer picture of what was developing. But the picture is complicated, as you might expect. The more information we have, the more precise it gets, but evolution is a complicated thing, especially when you have the data to be able to put your finger on some of these things. So what we need to do to find when we're most interested, remember this, keep your eyes on this focus, that we're interested in ourselves. This is an anthropology class. So we want to see when Homo sapiens sapiens, when we emerged, when did that happen, and how did that happen, and why did that happen, and where did that happen? But in order to do that, we have to really establish, if we're talking about anatomically modern humans, AMHs, we need to know what that means. So what is exactly so modern about a modern Homo sapien? What separates us? If we're evolved from Homo erectus, how are we different from Homo erectus? And once again, we should expect to see some transitional fossils that show that development taking place gradually. That's the way evolution works. Sure enough, there are some transitional fossils that show that these changes are taking place. But although we're the only ones in our genus left, we shared the planet with other competitors as well. That there were a lot of different evolutionary paths that were being taken. And so we have to think a little bit about theory as well, about how evolution works and what some of the models for the way these developments took place. So we'll come back to this a little bit later. So these are some of the questions that we want to ask ourselves. How do we identify us in the archaeological record? And we're going to see the first traces of Homo sapiens, us, modern humans. And where do we find these? So where is our origin? Where is our point of origin? And also, how are there more than one Homo sapiens? Are there different strategies? And how did they interact? And why are we the winners? Why did we emerge as the ones that survived whereas others didn't? And so these are some of the questions that we want to look at in this chapter. So if you're following along with the slides that are already on Canvas, you can see that there's a slide that talks about what is so modern about modern humans. And on the top slide, top of the picture is a modern human, which is from Dolní Věstonice, which is in the Czech Republic. This is from around 30,000 years ago. And on the lower bit, you can see an older cranium from the site of Atapuerca. It's an archaic Homo sapiens. And I'm going to use these terms a lot. So anatomically modern human is us. Those are all the anatomical features that we have. Now, there's a difference between anatomically modern humans and behaviorally modern humans, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But at least in terms of physiology, AMH equals us. That is us. And we share the same anatomical features that within a sort of a range of possibilities with those earliest AMHs. But the difference between a Homo erectus that we saw last chapter, which began about 1.8 million years ago and continued up to a couple 100,000 years ago, where is the line between a Homo erectus and a anatomically modern human? Well, there's a period in there where you can't really say. That physical anthropologists argue about whether this should be called an anatomically modern human or whether this should be called a Homo erectus. And the category that we use for this sort of period of time where that transition is taking place is what we call archaic Homo sapiens. So archaic means that they're older than anatomically modern humans. They're further back in time than anatomically modern humans, but they're starting to show some of the features that are trending towards what we're going to see later on. And this Atapuerca skull that you see is an archaic Homo sapiens fossil. It's from about 500,000 years ago, as opposed to the top one, which is 30,000 years ago. The Atapuerca skull has a brain size which is within the range of modern humans. So why is it not an anatomically modern human? Well, because there are a number of anatomical features that we use to identify that you've got, it's sort of like a checklist. You've got to have this and this and this and this. Modern humans have a higher forehead and a rounder skull. I'm a good example to use on that. Higher forehead, although I'm male, which means it slopes back a little bit more than females. And a rounder skull, more like a soccer ball instead of like a football. And we have smaller faces with smaller teeth, smaller brow ridges. I don't have a big, thick brow ridge, and my chin projects out rather than coming back in. And below this, our skeletons are quite gracile. Don't have big, stocky bodies. And so these are the sort of things that modern humans have, whereas archaic humans have longer, lower skulls, larger brow ridges, and larger faces. There's often a football shape, like I said, to the skull, and a projection at the back called an occipital bun. Their front teeth tend to be pretty large, and there's usually no chin or very little chin. And the postcranial bones, the body bones, tend to be pretty robust, pretty strong and thick. There are the possibility that some of these different variations of archaic Homo sapiens could be called different species, and sometimes you'll see them referred to that. Like, for instance, Homo heidelbergensis is often used instead of Homo erectus, archaic Homo sapiens, or late Homo erectus. But for the purposes here, I just want to simplify things and say, let's just keep it to where we're talking about the end of Homo erectus and the beginning and the trend towards Homo sapiens, us. So how did this take place? Well, there's a couple of different models that we can look at. We can think of things like where did they come from? And was there just inheritance of one trend on one family tree started to expand, and then another family tree was going off in another direction? Or was there gene flow, mixing of these things, and Homo sapiens arose out of the interaction between different groups and different survival strategies and different anatomical features? Well, we've got to look to the evidence. And so there is the possibility, I mean, theoretically at least, of having a single place of origin, like one group of ancestors that spawned all humans. Or is it a intermixing between these global populations? We saw that Homo erectus had a considerable amount of gene flow amongst the populations. You had anatomical features in Africa and anatomical features in Indonesia that were developing at the same rate, which means that they're probably in between Indonesia and Africa. You had a continuum of Homo erectus that were intermixing with one another and were developing at the same time and at the same pace. So the two competing models for how anatomically modern humans emerged is for one, the so-called out of Africa hypothesis. That is the very narrow version of where one group of Homo erectus started to develop into Homo sapiens, and then Homo sapiens then went out and conquered the world. There's also the multi-regional continuity hypothesis, which shows that actually there were different species. It rejects this displacement and this replacement of the Africas from Africa, and that actually multiple Homo erectus groups were emerging, and then they all kept blending together, and the result is that humans actually emerged from a combination of all of these Homo erectus archaic Homo sapiens groups developing into what we see today. So how do we know which of these is correct? And are they mutually exclusive? Well, we'll come back to this, and we'll look at the evidence to evaluate these models to see which one, or maybe a third option is correct. So we saw that Homo erectus was spread throughout the entirety of the Old World, and I mentioned that some of these populations seem like they had a lot in common with other populations. So in Indonesia and Africa and China, it seems like there was a lot of gene flow. But in Europe, the Homo erectus started to emerge characteristics, anatomical features, which were very specific to that region. And this largely had to do with the onset of what's called the Würm Glacial period. This is the ice ages. There were peaks and troughs where the temperatures, the global temperatures were rising and falling, and the glaciers were expanding and contracting, and they were having huge impacts on the environment and the resources available, especially in the northern regions in places like Europe. The archaic Homo sapiens, the late Homo erectus that were living there, were adapting to these changes in the environment and were developing cold adaptation features, which we'll see in a moment. At the same time, there were also Homo erectus that were still in Africa. And they were also, we've seen some of these before, the Bodo skull in Ethiopia from about 600,000 years ago, and another one, the Kabwe skull from Zambia from about 250,000 years ago. Both of these are within the range of modern human, the low end, but within the range of human-sized brains. Just to give you an idea, we shouldn't focus too much at this point on absolute numbers for cubic centimeters of brain size, because someone like Albert Einstein had a below average sized brain. Does that mean that he wasn't as clever as somebody with a larger brain? No, that's not the way it works. We're talking about averages and about the way the brain operates, and we'll come back to that, the use of the brain, later. So archaic Homo sapiens in Africa were starting to emerge, and we see that already by 600,000 years ago, Bodo had developed a size of a brain that was within the range of anatomically modern humans, but a lot of those other features were not there. They had a large brow ridge, heavily worn front teeth, meaning that they were actually using it as a third limb, so they were maybe fashioning clothes and things like putting their teeth were heavily worn even between them, so it showed that they were actually putting maybe sinew or thread or rope to do things with, in addition to their hands. So they were gripping materials that way. And by the time you come to Kabwe, about 250,000 years ago, this is well within the range of 1300 cc's, is well within the range of humans. But still with the brow ridge, still with the football-shaped brain case, and not the anatomically modern human features that we expect to see. You see these same kind of features then in Asia as well. The heavy brow ridge, big faces, large teeth, and you see so places like Nangdong in Indonesia, Narmada in India, and Dali in China, all of these have similar features to the ones that you see in Africa. So it seems like there's still gene flow taking place across Africa and Asia. And so this implies a certain amount of gene flow between these populations, even into the archaic Homo sapiens, so down to just a few 100,000 years ago. But in Europe, as I said, you start to see some developments emerging that are different. And these archaic Homo sapiens in Europe from about 500 to about 200,000 years ago, in Spain, Arago in Spain, Steinheim in France, in France, Cro-Magnon, Steinheim in Germany, in Petrolona in Greece as well. So these are places that you still get these long, low brain cases, but they're close to or within the lower end of the anatomically modern human range. They have but they still have the large brow ridges. The skeletons are quite robust, and they have a projecting face. But in Europe, there are some differences from what the other archaic Homo sapiens you see, and these foreshadow what we see in Neanderthals. So this suggests that this population was genetically isolating from the African and the Asian versions of archaic Homo sapiens. So they were becoming Neanderthals. Some suggest that this may even be given a different species name called Homo antecessor.